Welcome to this seminar on how to make sense of the new era in transatlantic relations. My name is Pernille Rike, and I am a research professor here at NUPI and also Center Director for ARENA Center for European Studies at the University of Oslo. This event is part of a project entitled Norway and the EU Undergoing Change. It is a project funded by and led by the Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and Jan Ole Gudmundsen is here. And it is undertaken in cooperation between NUPI and ARENA. In today's seminar, which for your information will be streamed live, we will explore the challenges facing the transatlantic relationship, and there are many and constantly developing. Donald Trump claims that European countries spend too little on defense, that the European Union trades unfairly with the United States, and that the EU was originally created to harm American interests. Well, the first is true. Europe needs to spend more on defense. The rest, not so much. Rather, in the aftermath of the Second World War, the United States played a central role in promoting European integration, both in the immediate post-war period and throughout the Cold War. And over time, the economies on both sides of the Atlantic became deeply intertwined. And today, trade between the EU and US constitutes only one component of a much broader economic relationship, and until recently also a relationship based on common values. The United States has not only accepted, but later also insisted on leading efforts to safeguard European security. Now, Trump's policies marks a significant departure from this tradition, undermining the trust on which US policy towards Europe has long depended. And today we are very fortunate to have Professor Erik Jones here to help us better understand the ongoing development in transatlantic relations, and I think you also would describe the current event as a kind of genuine break. For those who do not know Erik Jones from before, he is a widely recognized leading expert on European political economy and transatlantic affairs. He is currently director of Robert Schuman Center for Advanced Studies at the European University Institute in Florence. And he previously served as a professor at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies and has published extensively on European integration, economic governance, and global financial stability. And Jones is also a sought-after commentator in international media and co-editor of the journal Government and Opposition. So, Erik, we are very glad to have you here. The floor is yours.
Thank you guys so much for being here. I know it's a beautiful day. I know the weather is finally good. And since I live in Florence and we've had terrible weather this spring, I can only imagine the temptation to be outside instead, but I'm glad you're here. I'm also glad to be able to give this talk. I know my accent sounds like I just got off the plane from the United States, but I actually moved to Europe in 1988. And I've been living consistently across the European Union in different parts, east and west, north and south, trying better to understand what Europe is all about and telling stories about the United States along the way. And I have to be honest, this is the story I never wanted to tell. So I'm very happy to be here. I'm very grateful to NUPI and to ARENA for making this possible. But in many ways, I'm also very sad. And having said that, though, it's not the first time people have tried to tell stories like this. The very first time I wrote on the transatlantic relationship was in 1992, 1993, when I was working as a think tanker in Brussels. And everyone was terrified because Bill Clinton had been elected president. And Bill Clinton was not George W. Bush. And they thought that the transatlantic relationship was going to collapse as a consequence. And we had to write about that particular crisis. That wasn't really a crisis. But George W. Bush came and reassured us that things could get worse. And so we wrote about that crisis as well. But that didn't really feel like a crisis either. There was a lot of continuity despite that fact. 10 years later, we ended up writing about a crisis because Bob Gates, the U.S. Defense Secretary, told the Europeans they were going to have to learn how to defend themselves, or the United States was not going to be able to support them with congressional action. But that turned out to be not so big a crisis. even though the Obama administration was very unhappy with the situation in Libya, not very successful with the situation in Syria, they figured they would stick it out all the same. Even more recently, my co-author and I were writing a paper about the transatlantic relationship where we were saying the relationship is really not going very well. We submitted the article to Political Science Quarterly for publication in January of 2022. Then Russia came, messed up our plans by invading Ukraine with a full-scale invasion, and the referees sent the paper back to us and said, look, the transatlantic relationship is obviously doing well right now because of the Russia-Ukraine war, so it's not a crisis. We rewrote the paper and came back and said, no, actually this time we think there's something serious that we have to talk about. And that's why I'm here. I mean, having said that, though, I want to stress the fact that while we're in a very tumultuous period, I always tell people there were many tumultuous periods in the past. And if you were to ask me, I'm much happier living now than I would be in the 1960s, for example. Because in the 1960s in the United States, the assassins were more numerous and there were better shots. And I say that in a kind of a laughing way. It's not funny. The political violence in the United States was much greater back then. I live in Italy right now. The political violence in Italy in the 1970s was far worse. And it was professors like me who were responsible for it, which made it even more problematic in many ways. And I could go through all of these decades and tell you horror stories that would remind you that bad things happened in the past as well. And so the things that we're experiencing right now, while they feel dramatic, and they are dramatic, it's not the things themselves that are the source of concern. It's not the events that we need to focus our attention on. It's the underlying forces that drive them that matter. And that's why I can look at all these past decades and identify points of tension, but the story I want to tell is much more fundamental than that. And that story has lots of components that mix domestic politics with international relations. On the domestic side, one of the things that we've been focusing on is the possibility that we would elect people to government who actually don't want the government to function. This project on democracy without solidarity that we did in the mid-2010s, it's actually a project that I started in 2010, said, well, wait a minute, you can have the best constitutional design in the world. If the people you elect to make the Constitution work don't want it to work, it won't work. And that's what we're seeing right now in spades. We also said there's something going wrong in our democratic politics. I did a big survey of the literature on populism and found that across advanced industrial societies, liberal democracies are not doing very well, often for many of the same or similar looking reasons, because there's something weird in the interaction between the globalized world economy and democratic politics that's causing mainstream political parties to lose their hold over the electorate and new challengers to emerge that don't understand or don't want to understand the political process the way it was meant to function. So this whole democracy without solidarity problem was not an accident. It was part of a larger political movement. And it's that political movement that causes concern. It's a political movement that causes concern because what it does is upsets the global balance. The way we pull countries together in collaborative arrangements all depends on our ability to compromise in domestic politics in order to reach agreement in international relations. And if we can't compromise in domestic politics, then we can't reach agreement in international relations. Think about the transatlantic trade and investment partnership that was negotiated in the early to mid 1990s. This was supposed to be low-hanging fruit in trade relations. We were just going to do some light regulatory convergence. We were going to recognize regulatory equivalence. We were going to promote investment and jobs by streamlining the transatlantic economy. And they threw a few whistles and bells in for third-party dispute resolution. when investors and states come into conflict. But there was nothing new or dramatic about this arrangement, and yet it failed on both sides of the Atlantic for domestic political reasons we could not anticipate. And in that context, it became important for us to begin trying to understand something that we hadn't really studied seriously as academics. As academics, we'd studied integration, European integration, globalization, Americanization, call it what you want, but it was all about creating common markets and bringing governments together in cooperative arrangements to promulgate new rules to make life easier so that we could distribute labor across the planet. And suddenly we needed a theory of disintegration, how we understand the world coming apart again, something that we actually never built institutions to manage because it wasn't supposed to happen. And so that's why this time is different, because our domestic politics is different, our domestic politicians are different. They are a feature of the system and not a bug. and being a feature of the system, they're upsetting our ability to do international relations the way we used to do it in the past, and the world is breaking apart as a consequence. That's why I'm up here today, right? Not because of the transatlantic relationship or some spat between the US president and some politician in Brussels that nobody's ever heard of, but because of something much more fundamental. We're all growing apart, and we're all growing less interested in the outside world at the same time. I'm going to give you 3 illustrations of this disinterest and inattention that caught my attention as I was preparing this talk and the article on which it's based. And that was when J.D. Vance went to the Munich Security Conference. J.D. Vance, who's the product of elite education in the United States. He served in the military, he went to Ohio State, but then he did his law degree at Yale Law School, which is the preeminent law school in the United States. This is where Hillary Clinton and Bill Clinton met, right? He gave a speech in the run-up to the German elections where he said the greatest threat to European democracy is Germany's suppression of the Alternative für Deutschland, the right-wing extremist party in Germany's right to express itself freely, right? And for most Germans on the scene, this was a terrible shock. As a matter of fact, many of my friends who were at the Munich Security Conference reported people crying in the aftermath of that event because it shook them so fundamentally. We need to figure out why that is. That's a problem that has to do with legitimacy in the transatlantic relationship. There was another issue, which is Donald Trump, who said this in his first administration, but he keeps saying it, and he says it in really weird ways. He says that the European Union was created to take advantage of the United States. And if you read Project 2025, which is the 900-page policy manual that was crafted by the Heritage Foundation to inform the new Trump administration on how to dismantle the government, you'll find in the very opening pages an anecdote about how Democrats are so out of touch with the American electorate, they have more in common with bureaucrats in Brussels than they have with moms and dads who take their kids to football games on the weekends. Now, when bureaucrats in Brussels become the metaphor for alienation in American politics, that's strange. I don't think most Americans know where Brussels is. And so in that context, I think we should be concerned that the European Union has become a metaphor for alienation. And I could go into that in the question and answer. I have a theory that's going to be even more disturbing, so I'm encouraging you to ask that question, but I'm not going to volunteer that information unless you're really curious. This is a story about integration and the way the United States feels about integration right now. There's a third thing. I'm sure you all know we have a defense secretary who used to be a weekend anchor on Fox News and now is celebrated as the guy who made Signal the alternative to WhatsApp, a famous communication application. But Pete Hegseth actually came on the 12th of February and gave a speech in Brussels where he said, you know what, we think we're going to withdraw most of our American troops out of Europe because we've had too many troops here for too long. And we're going to specialize in providing nuclear deterrence, and we're going to let the Europeans handle the rest, all that conventional stuff, right? And this is about security, and it shows a profound misunderstanding of how transatlantic security operates. And so we're going to have to talk about that as well. So that's really the structure of the next part of our conversation, is about legitimacy, integration, and security, the 3 bullet points in the subtitle that Pernilla read out earlier. Let's talk about legitimacy. Look, anybody who thinks that the United States came to Europe at the end of the Second World War to dominate the European economy has clearly misunderstood what the United States was doing at the end of the Second World War. It was trying to bolster Europe economically. Why? Because the United States knew, and so did most Europeans, that bad economic performance was an open door to communism. And if your goal is to prevent all of Europe from falling under the influence of the Soviet Communist Party, then you want to bolster Europe's economies. And in bolstering Europe's economies, you've also got to provide security. And so this economics and security in the transatlantic relationship is not the goal. It's not for us to be rich and secure. The goal is to commit everyone to liberal democracy. Now, how do we know that the goal is to commit everyone to liberal democracy? Because the arrangements that were created were arrangements that allowed as much policy autonomy as possible for European governments. It wasn't the kind of domination that the Soviet Union tried to exercise in Central and Eastern Europe. On the contrary, it was exactly the opposite. And in doing so, what they were trying to do is to reassure Europeans that they could do whatever they want while they participate in an international division of labor. They could do whatever they want so long as they embrace liberal democracy. Now, for Europeans, many Europeans, this was an open door that the United States was pushing on. They wanted to embrace liberal democracy, but for many Europeans, there were deep suspicions that not every country in Europe was equally committed to that goal, particularly Germany, which had abandoned democracy in the interwar period. Many Europeans looked at Germany and said, look, this is not something that we trust. But also Italy, which had the largest communist party in Europe, trying to convince the Italians that they should commit to liberal democracy was difficult. Trying to convince everybody else that the Italians were committed to liberal democracy was even more difficult. And so what the United States did was interfere actively in European politics, consistently from one country to the next. You all know the stories, right? I don't want to put this in a positive light that the CIA played such an active role, although the CIA did found the institution where I did my graduate work, right? The Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies in Bologna, Italy, was actually financed originally by one of the foundations that came from the CIA. And we know that because the original director was an old OSS pre-CIA operative who participated in the liberation of Italy. So, it wasn't all bad, but it was annoying. It was the price that Europeans paid for getting the economic and security assistance, was having the United States interfere in their domestic politics. And that interference extended for a long, long time. Richard Gardner, who was the ambassador to Italy in the late 1970s, spent most of his tenure trying to force the Italian Communist Party from participating in government after they had emerged as the largest political force in Italy after the Christian Democrats in the 1976 elections, right? And that open interference is something that he and I talked about later, where he was complaining because George W. Bush had invited Silvio Berlusconi to address the joint houses of Congress before the 2006 elections in Italy. And Ambassador Gardner said, oh, this is outrageous. How could he interfere in Italian politics? And I said, but Ambassador Gardner, you prevented the PG. You single-handedly prevented the PG from coming into government. And he said, yes, but that was our duty, right? We had to do that. Now, Europeans didn't like this interference, but they tolerated it. They tolerated it because they understood what it meant. And it meant that they would have different rules from the rules we find in the United States. They would have rules that would forbid Nazi rhetoric or forbid the denial of the Holocaust. They had rules that would suppress political parties that had advocated violence. They had rules that did all of these things. These are the rules that the AfD runs afoul of. And for J.D. Vance to say that these rules should be pulled away is not a sign of the maturity of European democracies. It's an insult to all of the effort that went into building these liberal democratic arrangements and insulating them from the possibility that they would go in another direction. And so when J.D. Vance said that, the Germans were upset because they had for generations accepted exactly the opposite message from the United States. And I'm not surprised they took that very emotionally. I'm also not surprised that Europeans take umbrage at the fact that the United States says the European Union was created to do damage to the U.S. economy. Look, the precondition for getting assistance from the Marshall Plan was for European governments to work together. And that meant the French having to sit down with the Germans in the late 1940s to plan their recovery from the Second World War, right? From the damage that they had done to one another. And they had to orchestrate that in the context of the Organization for European Economic Cooperation, which became the OECD, which was supposed to be the American-led model for European integration. And the Europeans said, you know what, we don't want an American-led model for European integration. We want our own model instead. And so they built the European Coal and Steel Community as an alternative arrangement to take the Ruhr, which was occupied at that time, to put it under supranational control, to allow the Germans to have a say in what went on in their own industry and territory, but to manage it jointly. And the Americans said, okay, you want to do it differently? That's great. We'll support you in that effort instead. And the United States has supported European integration consistently ever since, not least because by supporting European integration through the coal and steel community, through the economic community, the United States built its own interlocutor, particularly in issues like trade. This way, it was much easier for the United States to negotiate the Kennedy round of the GATT agreement or the Tokyo round of the GATT agreement, because it had a single voice to deal with on the other side of the Atlantic. And this was hugely beneficial to the United States. Because by having a single voice, by getting a single set of rules in Europe, U.S. business prospered significantly. That's why the French got so upset in the 1960s and said, there's an American challenge out there that we have to face. They're using their unique privileged position in the Bretton Woods system and in this general agreement on tariffs and trade. They're using their privilege to invade our economy. And the Belgians were like, what are you talking about invade? We've invited them in. We're really happy. We've got all this industry. Europe grew dramatically by dint of that, but they also grew dramatically by dint of its own integration. And this notion of integration became fundamental. As we progressed through the 1970s, 1980s, into the 1990s, when I showed up in Brussels in 1989 in the spring, the completion of the internal market and the 1992 project was in full swing. And the biggest voice in that project was the American Chamber of Commerce, which brought together these huge multinational enterprises that all worked in Europe and benefited from the completion of Europe's marketplace. Everybody won. When Pernilla talked about the extent of trade across the Atlantic, it's about $3.7 trillion in trade across the Atlantic in both directions. The amount of American business that takes place in Europe and European business that takes place in the United States by dint of their shared investments is more than 3 times that. The trade is the tail. The dog is the fact that these big multinational corporations exist on both sides of the Atlantic. And that was the integration that they fostered. And that's the integration that we have preserved. The problem is that when Trump says that the EU is built to take advantage of the United States, he's making a mockery of all that. And he's threatening to break these multinational corporations apart. Most of the trade that goes across the Atlantic within the same firms. So by putting tariffs on European exports to the United States, what he's doing is basically putting a big cost wedge in the middle of supply chains that operate within the same firms. He's breaking those firms apart. And if he succeeds in inviting European investment into the United States, that will be to close those enterprises off. No wonder the Europeans are upset. This is not how it was supposed to work. And by the way, there's a whole aspect of finance that we could add into this that would complicate the story a little bit, but that makes it even more problematic. Because Europe does a lot of business in dollars, but you know what? The biggest and most important base pair in any foreign exchange operations or any foreign exchange market in the world is the euro-dollar base pair. Most transactions take place between the euro and the dollar, right? And so if you lose the euro, the dollar loses a lot of importance as well. And this is something that we used to take for granted, but now seem to have to explain. And then we talk about security. Now, the security piece of the puzzle is complicated because, like I mentioned, most of the concern for European security was focused not on the Soviet Union, but on Germany. The first organization that brought Europeans together in a formal sense, the Brussels Treaty Organization in 1948, was targeted at the need to stop the aggression from Germany, right? And the language that they put in the mutual defense clause of that organization is so strong. It says that if any country is attacked, presumably by Germany, all the other members will have to give everything at their disposal in order to prevent that member state from succumbing to the aggression, right, to protect them. The United States looked at that language and said, wait a minute, that language is way too strong. So when they wrote Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty, they wrote Article 5 to be a weaker commitment. The Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty says, we'll come to your defense with everything that we think is necessary, right? That's a much more credible commitment. Interestingly enough, the Europeans, for whatever reason, have kept the language of Article 4 of the Brussels Treaty intact. And they repeated that language in the West European Union that was signed in 1955. They carried it through the West European Union all the way into the Lisbon Treaty. So if you look at the language of security guarantees in the Lisbon Treaty of the European Union, it is the same as that 1948 language that the Americans rejected, right? It's a much stronger security guarantee, but it's much less credible because of its strength in an odd sort of way. This is an important anecdote to tell you because credibility is the key to security guarantees. It's the key to security commitment. Even more important, it is the key to nuclear deterrence. I mentioned the West European Union because that was the framework that they created to allow for the rearmament of Germany. And when they created that framework, they put specific limits on the amount of weaponry that Germany could hold, which you can understand in the late 1950s. Those limits only came off at the end of the 1980s, beginning of the 1990s. And the whole time during the Cold War, the United States insisted on maintaining conventional dominance in Europe. Now, there was a reason for that. And that's because at the end of the 1950s, the United States realized that the threat to use nuclear weapons through a process called massive retaliation was simply incredible. Nobody would believe it, right? We had two really good movies to explain just how dumb that idea is, right? One is called Fail-Safe, which I highly recommend you watch, even though you probably haven't seen it. And for those of you who like it, George Clooney has done an updated version of it, so you get the George Clooney eye candy in addition to the movie itself. The other was Dr. Strangelove. And these two films came out at the same time to explain why massive retaliation doesn't work. But the alternative to massive retaliation is to control the ladder of escalation through superior dominance at each stage. This is why the United States has consistently spent more on Europe's conventional defense than Europeans have. Because for the American nuclear deterrent to be credible, it must control the ladder of dominance, or the ladder of escalation at each stage, so that each step further is believable if it leads eventually to a strategic exchange of nuclear weapons between the United States and the Soviet Union, right? So this was the theory, right? It's not the only theory of deterrence we had. We also had a crazy man theory that was written by Charles de Gaulle and his assistant Michel Dupré, and they built their own nuclear deterrent, and they did it with United States help, actually, because the United States wanted to make sure to underpin the credibility of this strategic arsenal that's based in the U.S. and in the U.S.-based nuclear submarine fleets. But the critical thing to say is that the credibility of the deterrence worked. And we've seen many times where the Soviets backed down in the face of the prospect of uncontrolled escalation. And that worked great. And now Pete Hegseth says we're going back to massive retaliation? Nobody believes that. Nobody believes the United States is going to trade the history of the world for Riga. And so what protects Riga once American conventional forces are moved out of the way? It's not immediately obvious. And the French theory for nuclear deterrence actually was based on the defense of the French nation. It can't extend all the way to the Baltic states. Otherwise, it's as incredible as American massive retaliation. So the French would have to engineer some kind of conventional domination of the ladder of escalation in a similar way, but they can't do that. And so we don't have a theory for nuclear deterrence that operates right now. That's what Pete Hegseth took away. That's why the Poles are talking about developing nuclear weapons, because they know there is no credible theory of deterrence that operates right now. And given that Russia has shown a proclivity toward aggression, that's not a good thing. That's not to say Russia's crazy and wants to engage in nuclear war. On the contrary, what it is to say is Russia knows we can't engage in nuclear war, and so it will do what it wants, pushing the envelope to see how far it can go. And then if we push back, it'll stop and wait and try again later. And this is the problem that Pete Hegseth unleashed, and he could not have picked a worse time to do that, right? Because the transatlantic relationship was on such weak foundations, as I've already pointed out. Because globalization has focused attention on domestic adjustments, on the rise of populism, and on the failure of the economic consensus, because we don't have a view of how economics works that we share across the Atlantic anymore. And because rising powers have actually begun to assert their influence through the multilateral arrangements that were meant to govern the global economy at the end of the Second World War and from then on. And as they've done that, the Europeans have tried to preserve their privileged position, and the United States has gone the other way and said, well, you know, if you're going to take over the WTO, then we're just going to stop it from working, right? And because of something that I haven't talked about, because it's really complicated, which is the weaponization of interdependence. You see, as the United States has gotten weaker and weaker relative to the rest of the world, the United States discovered something that was actually unexpected, which is that everybody trades in dollars. Maybe not all of their trade, but some of it. And trading in dollars means they actually have to use banks that can swap dollars with one another through a process called clearing to make the use of dollars more efficient. The United States can control access to US dollar clearing. And by controlling access to US dollar clearing, it can prevent people, firms, even whole governments, from engaging in dollar-denominated transactions, which means he carves them out of the world economy. The United States can also take advantage of the fact that there is a messaging system that connects most banks in Europe and in the United States, called SWIFT, right? The Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunications. Bet you never really knew what that acronym meant. But SWIFT exists to connect American and European banks and is essential for transacting in dollars or euros. And since the euro-dollar base pair is the most important base pair in foreign exchange transactions, if you can prevent people from accessing SWIFT, you can make it very hard for them to communicate any of those transactions or any of the post-trade transactions that follow. That's what the Obama administration did to Iran in 2012. That's what they threatened to do to Russia, but decided not to in 2014. And that's what the Biden administration did to Russia in 2014. was cut Russian banks out of SWIFT. The United States also controls all the cloud computing. Virtually all of the cloud server computing, the big 5 cloud server providers, exist in the United States, which means they can get access to even your encrypted messages, right? And they do. And we know this because that's how they broke open the big spy rings that China was running in the United States, was by getting into the iPhone accounts of suspected Chinese espionage agents. And the problem is that this weaponization of interdependence, this use of shared infrastructures, either to learn more about you or to stop you from doing what you otherwise would do, did not go unnoticed in Europe. And the Europeans have been sitting around for the last better part of a decade or more, asking themselves, well, wait a minute, do we really want the United States to be able to eavesdrop on us? Do we really want the United States to be able to stop us from making payments? Do we really want the United States to force us to cut banks out of the Society for Worldwide International Financial Telecommunications, which is what the United States did both in 2012 and in 2018 when the Trump administration reneged on the Iran nuclear weapons deal and reimposed sanctions on Iran. So in that sense, there was already a problem. This is what my colleague and I were writing about prior to the war in Ukraine, Russia's full-scale invasion, and that problem hasn't gone away. Europeans are deeply distrustful. The first time they used strategic autonomy was not about strategic autonomy in the military sense. It was about strategic autonomy in the use of digital platforms, in the storage of digital information, in the maintenance of these shared infrastructures. And so the Europeans were already suspicious, and the Trump administration came and told them, you were right to be suspicious. And that's the problem. Because by challenging the commitment to liberal democracy, European integration, and collective security, the Trump administration has effectively broken the trust that Europeans had, and it's forcing them to make hard choices, right? Because getting out of all these binding commitments is very expensive, time-consuming, inefficient. And not only do they feel like they're being forced to make hard choices, but they feel a little bit stupid, right? Because they've been through this before. It was less intense, but the whole language of strategic autonomy emerged in 2017, just after Trump was elected. Europe began to equip itself with its anti-economic coercion instrument as a result of the behavior of the Trump administration when it tried to impose tariffs in 2018. They've seen this before. They just didn't plan enough ahead. They just didn't invest enough effort. And now they feel like a lot of time has been wasted. And they also recognize that Trump is probably serious because they obviously don't care about the old military agreement. Trump is probably serious about pulling out of not NATO per se, but out of the way NATO used to be. They've even talked about giving the Supreme Commander for Allied Forces Europe over to a European. And the Europeans recognize that this means that they actually have to consolidate their borders. They have to make sure that they are more resilient to outside threats. They're going to have to enlarge to Ukraine, Moldova, the Western Balkans. It's going to be very challenging, but it's much more secure for them to do that than to leave these open wounds for third parties to exploit. The geopolitics of enlargement pushes them very strongly in that direction. And as they do these things, which are really difficult choices that they otherwise would not make. Look, they tried to avoid enlargement for the better part of 2 decades after the historic enlargement to Central and Eastern Europe, apart from Croatia, which is because they have really nice beaches there. But for the rest, they were ready to not do that at all. Even Emmanuel Macron went so far as to say, no, this is just not serious, right? We're not going to do this. Now Emmanuel Macron is leading the charge for this kind of enlargement to take place. And he's doing so because he knows not only that Europe is vulnerable in security terms, but also because he's worried that Europe is going to have to choose at some point between the United States and China. And no one knows how that change is going to affect Europe's economic performance and Europe's ability to defend itself, right? So what are the implications? Look, like I said, it's not events that we need to focus on. It's the movements that take place beneath them. So the implications are that we're going to start to witness a bunch of microfractures, a bunch of little decisions that will create path dependencies, that will make it more likely that Europe will evolve away from the United States than closer to the United States. They'll start procuring more weapons from Europe rather than from the United States. They'll start de-risking their supply chains by consolidating them closer to the European Union. They'll start using regulation to create barriers to integration between the United States and Europe, and using regulation to impose their own values and standards, even if the United States won't follow them. And as that happens, what we're going to see is an increasing wedge. This is the reverse of the process that the transatlantic trade and investment partnership was meant to achieve, right? It's exactly the opposite. So they're going to introduce an anti-transatlantic trade and investment partnership, in a sense, and you won't see it on the surface. But beneath the surface, it's going to push them in a very different direction, particularly in terms of those infrastructures I talked about for currencies, for payments, for cloud storage, and data localization is going to become a watchword. By the way, that's what China does as well, right? So everybody is going to localize their data in that context. So this does not mean that the West is going to end, right? The compass point will still be there. It just means that Europe and the United States, having a lot in common, will not work as cohesively as partners as they did in the past. And that makes them less persuasive as a joint entity in trying to negotiate with the rest of the world, which, by the way, is going to continue to get more self-reliant as well. And as a consequence, I think the world is going to fragment in terms of its economic performance. And this, just to underscore that we're here on behalf of a program about Norway and the European Union, this is going to force Norwegians to reconsider their relationship with the European Union. I don't envy you that debate. It's going to be a very challenging conversation. There's no obvious answer, but the context has changed since 1994. And with a change in the context, it's worth reconsidering the question, let's say. Anyway, if you want, you can read the article in greater detail and get some of the stories without my historical inaccuracies, because my editors are much better than I am at getting the facts straight, from the latest issue of Survival, and you're welcome to reach out to me by email or go to my website and find other stuff. But I'm very grateful that you came, and very happy to have the opportunity to speak with you.
Thank you so much, Erik. This was fascinating and a bit gloomy picture of transatlantic relations and in what direction it is moving. And I think particularly in Norway, this is a challenge, of course, as you ended with. We have this special relationship with the EU, and we have always been a country very with kind of very close relations to the US. And of course, when that changes fundamentally, and I think there is still a certain hope in Norway that this is just a phase and that soon we will be back to normal. But I think you're right in saying that this is a much deeper crisis and a deeper rupture. You also mentioned the different crises, that there has been different crises before in the transatlantic relations. And when you started out, I was thinking, yeah, well, this is completely different, and I felt that, but you ended that this is different. And of course, often when there is crisis, for instance, in the French-German relationship, I always tend to say, well, this always been a crisis, so it's not that, I mean, you shouldn't take it that serious. But I think this time it's something very much more profound, and it demands Europe to do to do some really changes, kind of policies completely. And I wanted to ask you what you think about that. Do you think that the European Union is capable of taking these steps? Of course, strategic autonomy, it has been on the agenda for some time. It has taken some time to really kind of implement it. But as you said, from 2017, well, it has been slower than one would have hoped, maybe. But now it's kind of speeding up. And it's also speeding up when it comes to, on the economic side, to be more independent and have strategic autonomy on the economic side. We have the Draghi report on the competitiveness. So there are things that are happening, but I just wonder what are your views on the kind of the likelihood of European Union to really kind of take this, understand the risks, and really kind of move in the direction of being more independent in both security and economics.
So, Pernilla, thank you so much. This is something that we all wrestle with, right? Because we look at the European Union and it's a gray amorphous blob, right? I teach European integration. I edited the Oxford Handbook on the European Union. So I have a pretty good sense of how little I know about the EU, and I imagine many other people know even less, right? Except the people who work there, who know a huge amount, right? But they don't know anything about how it all fits together. I mean, it's just big and confusing. And when you look at it, there's a terrifying sense that this entity can't do anything. But entities don't do anything. They don't. People do things. And it's the people who need to realize the moment. And it's the people who need to articulate the vision and who need to get other people to agree with them. One of the biggest arguments I've been having in Brussels is they need a vision for what the European Union can accomplish if Europeans are going to use the European Union to achieve anything. And increasingly, you see that vision beginning to crystallize. So yeah, it's got a complicated constitutional arrangement. Yeah, the institutions are weird and hard to understand, but the people who understand them are beginning to realize the necessity for using them, and they will. And I see this particularly in the enlargement context. I've been both in Kyiv and in Brussels working on the enlargement project, which is on the face value kind of crazy, right? Because it's like the biggest bureaucratic process you could imagine. You got to take 100,000 pages of legislation, translate it into Ukrainian, and then approximate it into Ukrainian law. And I met the woman who's responsible for the approximation in the Department of Justice, and she has no team yet, right? And I was like, this is crazy. But they have to do it. So they're going to do it. I mean, it's not a question. They will make this happen, because they have no choice. And I think that's true if you talk to the people at DG Enlargement, which is now called ENIST. If you talk to them, they will say, we have to do this. We have no choice. I think that's the thing we need to focus on. It's hard, it's bureaucratic, it's confusing, but it's necessary. And it's amazing how much confusing bureaucratic work you can get done when it's necessary. I know that as an American, I file my own taxes, right? It's very bureaucratic and confusing, but every year I manage, right? And so in that sense, I think Europe can do it too. And I don't mean to belittle the challenge. I mean to put humans at the center of it, because it's humans that are going to make this possible, right?
And then we have seen from history that when there is a real crisis, then we see that the EU has a tendency to pull its acts together. And now it's kind of an even bigger crisis on so many fronts. Kari, you.
Thank you so much, Erik. This was very interesting, and I think you've painted with a big brush, and you pointed towards larger dividing lines across the Atlantic. However, you did not say so much about how to deal with this, and I would challenge you on that. I mean, you alluded to what Norway should do, and you also mentioned the more disturbing explanation. So I would, challenge you both on how to deal with this, what should Europe do in order to increase the cooperation across the Atlantic, but also, yes, I'll leave it with that.
So this is actually the second draft of the article that got published. The first draft was finished before Trump's inauguration. And it is one of a series of articles I wrote about how to deal with the incoming Trump administration. And there are some very simple tricks that you have to do, right? The problem is the Trump administration blew up my first draft with those events that I talked about. And my editor said, Erik, you have to write a completely new draft, right? And so that's what you got, was the completely new draft. What Corey wants is the first draft. And the first draft goes like this. Look, the people around Trump are not the best and the brightest. They're the most loyal. And loyalty does not give you any insight into their economic thinking. They don't all think the same about economics. Many of them don't think about economics at all. And some of them think about economics really from a business perspective that is completely at odds with Trump administration policy. So the trick is to go to them and to split the coalition and get it to reform around a different objective. This is what Jean-Claude Juncker did when he went and visited Trump in July of 2018. You're faced with this tariff. It doesn't make any sense. You split the coalition around Trump. You say, look, we'll negotiate a free trade deal with you, right? We'll give you some regulatory convergence. We'll buy a little bit of chlorinated chicken or hormonal beef, whatever we have to do to get through this. And you say, oh, look, squirrel, there's China. Why don't we work together on China? And then the only thing that unites the team around Trump is that they are viscerally afraid of China. And so they will pivot to focus their attention on that. When Juncker did this in July of 2018, it was remarkably successful, particularly given that he is an EU Commission president, right? It was remarkably successful. They did the preparatory work for the free trade negotiations. The negotiations never happened because the Trump administration doesn't have the bandwidth to do this many things at once, or didn't at the time. Now it seems to have more bandwidth, although we'll have to see if it's sustainable. And the whole problem went away, right? We didn't get out of the steel and aluminum tariffs, but for the rest, it was gone. And by the way, the Biden administration didn't get us out of the steel and aluminum tariffs either, right? So I think there was a chance to do that. There's a more fundamental thing, right? You see what Peter Navarro, the senior advisor on international trade to the Trump administration, both understands and refuses to acknowledge is that the imbalances are a result of macroeconomic policy, not trade policy. Europeans save vastly more than they invest in Europe. And some of that savings has to go abroad. And if you clear the capital account first in your balance of payments, then the goods account, right, the current account has to accommodate. Europe runs a serious current account surplus because it exports so much of its savings. And that means the rest of the world has so much more money to buy goods than Europeans have to buy goods, right? Because they sent that money abroad. And so Europe exports a lot. Germans like to say this is competitive. No, this is destroying your infrastructure by not investing enough in it, right? And so let's invest more in Europe. Let's embrace the Draghi report. That was the first argument I made. I've sold that argument to people around Trump, and they've said, oh, okay, well, that sounds like a good plan. Let's do that, right? And yet this assumes that the people around Trump, right, the big community of people, because I hardly ever even imagine in my wildest dream talking to people like, Besant or Navarro or Greer or any of the top name people. Why would I? That's not how policy is made. You talk to the lower people and then you hope the ideas filter up. And yet there seems to be a firewall between the lower people and the top people. And that was also something I did not expect. That did not exist in the first Trump administration. So while I have a strategy, and I think it's a viable strategy, and it would be good for Europe to embrace the Draghi report and to invest more and all this stuff it needs, I don't think it's working. And so I think we have to get ready for the fact that if our strategy doesn't work, we're going to have to do something else. And that something else is what this draft of the paper is all about.
What would you mean that, I mean, the Draghi report, the current commission is actually trying to implement the Draghi report. And it's not only the Draghi report, it's also, when it comes to security, it's the Minister report. So both these, so they have the plans are already there, and they started to implement it. Of course, it will take time. But would you say that they are not, kind of, you don't think they will manage to implement the Draghi report?
Oh no! Don't misunderstand it. Yeah, so I didn't mean to misspeak. No, they're trying to implement it. They're not using it as a gift to the Trump administration, right? I mean, you know, it's
Yeah, I see.
you were supposed to do what you already wanted to do, and say, look, because of you, I'm going to do what I already wanted to do, right? I mean, you know, that's my big concession. And if you can persuade people that you're doing what you already wanted to do is a big concession to them, then that's the best negotiating strategy of all, right? It's a win-win. Trump doesn't believe in win-wins, but it's still possible to get them out of the Trump administration. Unfortunately, in this time, we still have to do what we already wanted to do, but we're not getting anything out of the Trump administration as a consequence.
One question here.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Jones, for a very interesting introduction. My name is Knut Roger Andersen, and I'm from Delta Norwegian Public Sector Trade Union. I would like to raise a couple of issues for you. First of all, from a Norwegian point of view, it's quite difficult to see if there is any opposition in the US regarding the foreign policy, the trade policy, the defense policy. It looks like it is kind of a quiet support for what Trump is not doing regarding several issues when it comes to security and defense. And you mentioned in your speech that some of this initiative taken regarding that Europe should take more responsibility for own security was raised during the former President Biden, and also Trump, also Bush and other one. And I wonder, is this indicate that this is going to be the permanent situation in the relation between Europe and US, that you get a leak of a changing new policy where Europe have to do more by themselves, that United States doesn't longer have the focus? Because I was thinking back to the President George Bush Sr. from 1992 from 88 to 92. It was a very important period regarding the Berlin Wall. The Cold War ended, and many things happened. And he managed to have a very balanced foreign policy. And there are still of the Republicans, that generation, are still active, but they are very quiet when it comes to Trump's foreign policy to Europe now. So I would like you to ask you on that. And my final comment is very agree with you, your final comment on your last page, that Norway has to change, reorganize the Norwegian relation to Europe. President Putin succeed to get Finland and Sweden in NATO. I hope that President Trump succeed to get Iceland and Norway in the EU. But what do you think about that perspective? Thank you, sir.
So, Knut, first, thank you so much for your questions, and I very much appreciate what you said about George Herbert Walker Bush, the president from '88 to '92. As I mentioned at the start, right, the first crisis of the transatlantic relationship that I started writing about was when he stopped being president and Bill Clinton started, right? And I'm not trying to say it all went downhill because Bill Clinton became president, but that was a unique period. And what's interesting in the Republican Party is that the Herbert Walker Bush foreign policy was repudiated by W. Bush, right? And so Brent Scowcroft, who was the national security advisor to George Herbert Walker Bush, who was the architect of that foreign policy in many respects, he was completely alienated from the first George W. Bush administration. And that's when I moved from being a Republican to being a Democrat, right? Because I couldn't understand this shift in foreign policy. I was never really thrilled with Bill Clinton's foreign policy, but George W. Bush's foreign policy was awful, right? And it's gotten worse. And this gets to the point that you made at the beginning. It's gotten worse because Americans just don't care about foreign policy anymore. right? I mean, I I got involved in electoral politics for the first time in January of '07 because I read Barack Obama's book and I thought, wow, he actually wrote this, right? Which was shocking to me. And so I called all my friends until I found one who brought me onto his campaign. He never knew I was on his campaign, but I did write some speeches for him, and I wrote some of the policies and stuff like that when he was a no-hope candidate. And then when he became the official candidate, the professionals came and pushed me out, and so that was the end of that. But what was fascinating about that is how much I learned about how little foreign policy matters in American politics, right? I mean, if I ever felt self-important, being on a winning presidential campaign and knowing that you played no role in that victory at all, right? That killed any sense of self-importance. And unfortunately, that's only got worse over time. And that's my point about the cost of globalization, the domestic adjustment. Domestic politics is domestic in the United States. And it's not that they don't believe Ukraine should be freed of Russian aggression. They do. It's not that they don't believe there should be peace in the world. They do. And it's not that they don't believe that poor and sick people in other parts of the world should be helped. They do. It's that they're like, we'll talk about that when my problems are solved, right? And unfortunately, that's not a uniquely American perspective. Very unfortunately, it's becoming more commonplace. And when everybody's worried about their own problems, nobody's solving any problems at all. And I won't comment on your last remark. One of my first jobs as a think tanker in '93, '94 was writing a report on public opinion polling in Norway, Sweden, Finland, and Austria. And I remember the Norwegian public opinion pollsters were sort of like, we might be able to make this work. And then they came back and they were like, this did not work, right? And so I realized these are difficult choices, right? I also lived in the UK for a while and experienced Euroscepticism. And I understand where that attitude comes from. I don't agree with it, but maybe that's because I'm not in the position to experience the things that the people who do believe it feel. Right? And so I think we have to have an honest conversation about it and make a difficult decision. That's all.
Could I just add one question linked to that? Because there is no opposition, and this is something I think many of us are a bit astonished.
Yeah, sorry, I forgot.
Yeah. So, and one thing is, I mean, it could be linked to your response that kind of the domestic in U.S. public are not so interested in foreign policy, but now also, I mean, the American democracy is threatened. This is something they should be concerned about. And also now they have kind of the inflation, and there will be kind of negative effects of Trump's policy, and his support has declined. So, but there is not a lot of kind of opposition, not even if you listen to the media, and not the medias that kind of are quite supportive of Trump, but other American media is quite soft on the critique, is my view. So why is that?
So first, I've got some late night comedians I'm going to turn you on to.
I listen to them to get a bit more, have a different view. That's true.
But I think the reason that you're seeing a different kind of opposition from the first Trump administration, because remember the first Trump administration, we had the Million Woman March, right? As soon as he was elected. And now we're not seeing that. It's because the activists, the mobilizers, realized that didn't work. And it's not that there's a majority of people who support Donald Trump. He did not get a majority of the vote, right? And not everybody voted. So he represents a minority of the population, right? He just got a plurality. He did well enough in the election to win, better than we would have wanted him to do if we opposed him. But he's not popular, right? And if you look at his public opinion polling, particularly now, he's very unpopular, historically unpopular. It's just, how do you oppose him? And why there's no opposition to closing of USAID is because they're terrified he's arresting judges. He's deporting American citizens. He's deporting people in the middle of the night who never show up again. to foreign penitentiaries, right? This is crazy. I think most Americans are looking at the situation and saying, what next? And what do we do? And if you look at what Bernie Sanders and Ocasio-Cortez, her name just jumped out of my head, they're organizing demonstrations, 30, 40,000 people, anti-oligarch demonstrations. People care, but I think they're cautious. And here I will say, Trump has threatened to use the security forces of the United States, the police, the immigration control, the FBI, the military, violently against American citizens, right? So I'm not unhappy that we don't have big Black Lives Matters protest type things that would become a target for that violence. I want to be reassured that the forces of order do not exercise violence, that they exercise control before I put people in harm's way. Because if they do exercise violence, then we might go back to the 1960s, right? And I would be very reluctant to see that, right?
Svein Flotte, thank you for a very inspiring talk. You said that nuclear deterrence requires a large conventional force, and I agree that has been a theory for 80 years. But I just wonder whether the Ukrainian experience has shown us that may be obsolete, that it could maybe be replaced by flexible cyber warfare. If you see what Israel has achieved, both on the Stuxnet in 2010 in Iran, Hezbollah in Lebanon, and also in Iranian capital, Iran, with very targeted cyber warfare. I believe maybe the time could be mature for replacing soldiers with drones, artificial intelligence, and also more advanced cyber warfare, both as a threat deterrent, but also actual attacks, both for military targets, but also civilian targets. Could you comment on
that? So the deterrence that exists in Ukraine right now is a deterrence that pits the United States against Russia. And Russia has not used nuclear weapons. I don't think Russia really wanted to use nuclear weapons, but there was a moment in October, November of 22 where the Biden administration was convinced that nuclear escalation was possible. And the Biden administration put significant constraints on the Ukrainian use of American military provisions against Russian targets as a consequence, and serious limitations on the amount of military equipment that could be provided. So in that context, I would say that the deterrence was working, but unfortunately it was working against us, right? And the problem is that if we take the Americans away from the picture, that deterrence is going to work even more strongly against the Europeans. I know the Ukrainians are undeterred, but they face an existential threat, which is why the whole theory of deterrence that the French had made sense. When you face an existential threat, you'll take significant risks. But I'm not sure that the rest of Europe is ready to face a nuclear-armed Russia without something to offset that. Now, your point about cyber and drone warfare, the cyber warfare that the United States has undertaken in very specific contexts has been successful. Cyber warfare, the Russians have undertaken against Ukraine, not so much. And it's been successfully fended off. And so I think, when we heard about the electricity power outage in Spain and Portugal, I was concerned, but I'm reassured by the fact that is just bad engineering, right? And not a cyber attack. Doesn't mean it can't be, but we're not there yet. The drone point you make is much more important, right? I mean, we haven't talked about this because it's a totally different conversation, but the whole U.S. military posture, force posture, is based on very large military assets that are hugely expensive. And these drone swarms are not expensive. Look at the Russian fleet bottled up in the Black Sea, and you see that some of these assets may actually be stranded. And we haven't seen a full-scale push against America's large assets, carrier fleets in particular, by drone swarms. And I don't know what that would look like. I'm sure the Navy has gamed that out a million times. I'm sure they're comfortable with their defenses, I'm equally sure that the balance between defense and offense is going to tip on that at some point. And when it does, that's going to be a shock to American military supremacy at a global level. Because we're still going to be investing in these giant assets, and I think they will be stranded at some point by the forces that you identify. So I think that's something we need to focus on as well.
Øyvind.
Yes.
Oh, sorry, Øyvind first. It's one first. It's another one before you. Just Øyvind.
Øyvind Svendsen, Senior Researcher at NUPI. Thank you for a truly interesting and compelling talk. You know, the Americans lead the world in a lot, and public speaking is one of them, so thank you. And I will surely read the paper. I have a question about on legitimacy, because the story you tell about how the US got involved in Europe is a story of building two things. It's a story of building a liberal international order, and it's a story of building a liberal democracy. And, you know, in the sense of the gloom and doom, and what worries me is what's happening now is the center is not holding. So it's an obvious undermining of liberal international order from the US presidency, and it's probably not going to go away with Trump. So one question for the liberal international order is, can Europe sustain a liberal international order? And then the second is, can liberal democracy in Europe, and you've done research on that too, so that's why I'm asking, can liberal democracy in Europe survive in the way it has in the recent decades without the central holding? And then I also have to pick your brain about the Norway point. You didn't want to respond to it. And I'll take it a slightly different angle. Because, and it relates to the question of if the Europe can sustain the liberal international order. If what's happening now, and we have a US-centric idea of this, right? Everything's falling apart because of the US. But if what's happening will force Norway, as you say, if I get it correctly, has to make serious, difficult decisions, otherwise you might be, you know, positioned outside of a strategically autonomous Europe. Wouldn't that be a like prime example of Europe, EU undermining a liberal international order? If its most tightly integrated state has to take serious decisions, otherwise we'll kick you out.
So, Ivan, these are great questions. I'm going to do the last one, right? The reason that I'm very cautious about talking about whether or not Norway should go into the European Union is because I really think that's a decision for Norwegians to make, right? I fundamentally believe that. And the guy who brought me into the Obama campaign, the guy called Phil Gordon, he made the mistake in the Brexit conversation of advising the British not to leave the European Union, and it just played badly in domestic debate. And you know, I'm good friends with Phil. He's an amazing guy, but I'm also willing to learn from his situation. Right? I won't say it was a mistake. He was a diplomat. He was asked to say this. So, but I want to learn from that situation. I don't think it's my place. That said, you make a very good point. We had a liberal order and a liberal democratic arrangement, and they were meant to be self-reinforcing. Right? I don't believe the liberal order is working very well right now. And without the United States, and the United States has been actively undermining it under the Obama administration and the Trump administration and the Biden administration, and now again, so the United States has been undermining its own liberal international order. I think the European Union can try to hold on to what it can try to hold on to, but let's look at what the European Union is trying to hold on to. It's trying to hold on to disproportionate voting weights in the IMF. That's part of the liberal international order. I don't think they're going to succeed in that. Or the IMF is, either the IMF is going to be sideswiped, sidelined, or the IMF is going to be reformed, right? So it is what it is. I think the order that we're going to get is going to be different. This is, you can tell I've been influenced by my colleague Trina Flockhart, who believes in the existence of multiple orders. And I think that the European Union will have an order that it insists upon, but it won't be a world order or world system. It'll be a European order. right? Can European liberal democracy survive within that order? There are lots of European countries that I would not characterize as democratic right now, right? I wrote a paper for the Journal of Democracy on Hungary because I thought it was important for us to understand what went wrong in Hungary, which is the title of the paper, to see whether the enlargement criteria actually work, because Hungary was the best candidate for enlargement in 2002, and now it's the poster child for what the European Union doesn't want in the next round of enlargement, right? So that tells you something about the criteria, right? If the criteria didn't screen out but rewarded the country you want to avoid, then maybe the criteria need reform. The European Union doesn't want to hear that, but I think it's an issue that we have to face, right? And it gets to the core of the point that you were making. You know, one of the weird things about liberal democracy is that they create the opportunities for their own self-destruction. It's that simple. And is it liberal to prevent them from self-destructing? No, right? Is it liberal to encourage them to self-destruct? Yes, but then you don't get liberalism at the end of the process. I'm doing a lot of reading about the late 19th century right now. Everybody likes to think that we're in the 1930s. No, we're not. We're in the run-up to the First World War. And that period was a period that was much more challenging. And ironically, that's also the period that Donald Trump identifies with the most. So I think we have a lot of studying to do in how these systems and domestic polities interact. Anyway, thank you for your question.
I will just add to that on Norway, because what you said about Norway, and it's not really liberal to kick Norway out if there is a trade conflict between the US and they have to. But then it's not really true, because what the EU has to do in that situation, if they have to answer, is that they have to comply with WTO rules. So they are still complying with rules. And that will affect Norway because we are not in the customs union. So it's not really the case that they actually are still complying with the rules, because they cannot. At least it's not easy to see how they can make an exception for Norway. In addition to, compared to the other countries. Yes.
The EEA agreement, in my reading, states that the EEA law is above World Trade Organization law in the EU.
This is something that the lawyers do not agree on. Yeah. So it's not. I mean, this is the discussion, and maybe it depends. And this is, maybe we can discuss that over lunch. But I think ultimately we are not so sure how the EU will interpret this, and how what we see from until now is that probably they will follow the WTO rules. That is what the kind of the indications. But there are different views on that. So that's some uncertainties. Okay, there's another question here. Yes, now it's your turn. Sorry.
Thank you so much. Sylvia Kramer, formerly Chief Historian at the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, the U.S. Aerospace Agency, which among the federal government's various agencies is probably as internationally oriented in its programs and objectives as ever. Citing previous presidencies, to me, the key one in terms of appreciating the depth of the MAGA movement, which is, it's not about Trump, it's about the iceberg below Trump. The depth of the MAGA movement, I am old enough to remember the Reagan administration. And the key process that began under the Reagan was the privatization of the federal government. Okay? And then shifting, this is just to illustrate my point, shifting to J.D. Vance. To me, the key thing about J.D. Vance is not that he got a law degree from Yale, but that he's the author of Hillbilly Elegy. And that is the story of the world that gave us the Tea Party movement. And many of us will have forgotten the Tea Party movement. When I think of it, I think of these fabulous New Yorker cartoons ridiculing members of the Tea Party movement. But if you put these pieces together, sort of like a painting on a wall, an impressionistic painting, you see here are the key dabs of paint that give us the picture we have today. There are many others, but I just picked those two vignettes because, at least for me, they tell me that this is not over. In 4 years, no matter who gets reelected, this is not over. Your point about Americans not caring about foreign policy is absolutely spot on. To the extent that Americans care about foreign policy, it's in a romantic sort of way. Yes, Grandpapa fought in World War II, this kind of thing. So my observation about everything that you've told us is that indeed this is very real, that whether we want to call it preserving liberal democracy or whatever we want to call it, Europe must hang together.
It's not really a question. Do you want to?
I just want to say, I'm so privileged to meet you, Sylvia. The National Aeronautics and Space Administration is the most impressive branch of government, and to see it privatized into the hands of Elon Musk is just the most terrifying thing I could possibly imagine. So.
Final question here. If I have forgotten somebody, please let me know.
My name is Odd Gunnar Skagestad. And if you go back to the first of the frames you showed on the screen behind you, there is one sentence that more or less sums up the whole theme of this seminar, and that is the sentence, "This time feels different." Is that true? Yes, it probably is, but it's always been the case, as long as I can remember. And I can remember back to the Truman presidency. Well, seriously. And you showed it in showing the timelines and the various crises, the recurring crisis or senses or perceptions of crisis through all these decades. As for myself, I'll go back only 51 years, 1974. That was the year when I joined the Norwegian Foreign Service. It was also the year when I started to be an affiliate contributor to the Norwegian Atlantic Committee, one of the most prominent think tanks here in this wonderful city of Oslo. So in that year, 74, the Atlantic Committee published a book, not written by me, but a book called Transatlantic Crisis, with huge letters and no question mark whatsoever. That was the perception at that time. It's always been like that. I would like to say that my observation is, when you say that this time feels different, yes, perhaps it does. Well, it certainly does. But the main difference now, I think, is that this time is different. I think you could delete feels and just replace it with is. This time is different. And I think you demonstrated that in your lecture. I don't need to go into details about that. Thank you.
Yeah, I don't know. Do you want to? I think we will end here, but you can have some final.
I mean,
if you want to.
I think that's the best summation I could make of the argument. I have to say it's a great privilege to speak with all of you. I'm very, very pleased to be here. I gave a very similar talk in Washington in 2017 and tried to explain to my American colleagues then the importance of preserving the transatlantic relationship and why it's valuable. And I remember looking across the room, which was filled with members of Congress and their staff and other people from think tanks. And I started by saying, I can't believe I'm actually having to have this conversation, right? And I think you're right. I have to have this conversation because it's real. So thank you for joining me.
Thank you so much to you, and thank you for all the questions.
Thank you.